The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. This evening, we're very fortunate to have Marianne O'Donnell come speak to us from Shenzhen. So Marianne finished her PhD in anthropology at Rice in 1999. Before that, she had already spent time living in Shenzhen doing her field work and research there, and then came back briefly to defend and finish her dissertation, and then went right back and has been living in Shenzhen ever since. So she's got a good 20-some years under her belt of living in Shenzhen, and she's been quite active there in doing many things, as a teacher, as a sort of a local activist, as a scholar. Marianne has been, is well known, and indeed we were talking about this on the way over, is really a public intellectual in Shenzhen. And when I was in Shenzhen for a day talking to people about urbanization, and everybody I talked to in government offices and in NGOs said, oh, have you met Marianne O'Donnell yet? She's the person doing all of these exciting things on the ground in Shenzhen. So she has this sort of rich insider and outsider perspective, right? Very few anthropologists have the chance to live in the place that they're studying for 20 years and become a full participant in the kind of processes that they're also studying. So it's very nice to get that perspective. Also, very recently, January of this year, a book that she's a co-editor of, it's about Shenzhen, has just come out from the University of Chicago Press. Again, bringing together scholarship from many people who have only more recently begun realizing how exciting Shenzhen is, something that Marianne intuited really a generation ago, a little bit ahead of the curve, right? So join me in welcoming.
Thank you all. Thank you, Robin, for bringing me here. Thank you, Nuyet, for making it the logistics of me arriving possible. I'm going to do a lot of reading, in part because I think through, actually, as you can tell from the title of the book, I think in clunky groups of words. But the basic argument that I'm going to be making is that I have seen my understanding of what has happened since the end of World War II, kind of through the Cold War and then into reform and opening and into whatever era we're in now, has been a kind of meeting of the United States and China in terms of global governance. And these figured in terms of China, it's the figure of the male cadre, and in terms of the United States, it's the figure of the white male manager. And kind of these two figures come together in terms of politics, global political economy, as a kind of Chinese American system, but on the ground in terms of how is opportunity distributed, they come together in the idea of male makers, both Chinese and white North American male makers, who are currently running around together in Huaqiang Bay. And so we see this kind of the figuring of opportunity within a system that is increasingly not giving a lot of opportunities to people, get figured in these makers. And one of the reasons this is possible, I will argue, is because Shenzhen is the city in China which lives with the most US middle-class American values. And so most, especially after 2010, most foreigners who go to Shenzhen actually find Shenzhen very livable and not really Chinese enough that they feel, wow, exotic, but familiar enough that it becomes a place where they feel they can do business and make things happen. So with Shenzhen Condition, an anthropology of the intercultural. I'm turning Japanese, I think I'm turning Japanese, I really think so. And so this was the refrain from the song Turning Japanese on the album Clear New Days by the Vapors, which came out in 1980. How many of y'all were born? How many of y'all remember this song when it came out? Right, all right then. So anyway, it was, I'm turning Japanese, I think I'm turning Japanese, I really think so. All right. So for both North Americans and Chinese people, Shenzhen names an inherited condition. Simultaneously geopolitical and intercultural, innovative and oppressive, adaptable, whimsical, provisional, and scary global in its pretensions and reach. The Shenzhen Condition follows on piracy, colonial expansion, international socialism, the Cold War, the rise of the East Asian tigers, and the era of reform and opening. Currently, as the United States and the People's Republic of China, their allies, proxies, and sometimes enemies jockey for influence in the South China Sea, the city of Shenzhen is poised to play a critical role in China's One Belt, One Road maritime expansion. The Shenzhen Condition is also excruciatingly banal, suffusing everyday life in ordinary minds with a sense that suddenly, abruptly, and even unexpectedly, we're all living intercultural lives, but not the same intercultural lives, and certainly not lives with the same values, or if with the same values, with different understandings of how to express those values in everyday life. We've been blindsided by globalization, and Shenzhen's insertion into global manufacturing chains has been critical to new understandings of both what happened in the post-war era and where we as a planet are headed. Crudely put, I would suggest that we are turning toward a world system which increasingly assumes the political structure of China, a technocratic one-party system, and the economic structure of the United States, a tendency toward multinational monopolies that collaborate with technocratic state power. For lack of a better term, I'm thinking of this new world system as chimerica. So the cultural politics of turning toward. Marshall Solins once noted in his discussion of global capitalism's diverse cosmologies, quote, indigenous people struggle to integrate their experience of the world system in something that is logically and ontologically more inclusive, their own system of the world, close quote. Ultimately arguing that with respect to the world system, we're all indigens. It makes sense, in other words, that Shenzhen would mean something in the PRC and something else in North America, even as it also makes sense that all of us have a stake in China's largest and most successful SEZ. Nevertheless, most of us fail to see how intercultural all of our worlds have become. Moreover, the world system, and this was Stalin's point, was never only Western. The world system, such as it is something that connects us across borders without necessarily facilitating shared meaning, let alone shared values. In 1980, for example, the year that the Chinese central government established the Shenzhen SEZ, the Vapors released Turning Japanese. Songwriter David Fenton rebutted contemporary interpretations that the song was about masturbation, and seriously, people thought Turning Japanese was about masturbation, explaining, quote, turning Japanese is all the cliches about angst and youth and turning into something you didn't expect to, close quote. Perhaps. In retrospect, however, the international popularity of the song speaks to something much more prosaic, something bluntly literal. Containerization did return North Americans and Western Europeans toward Japan. It was just that because the conditions of surrender that had first returned Japan toward us, we, and I'm looking at you, white North America, failed to recognize our own turning for what it was. Let me make this point in a slightly different way. The place name Shenzhen glosses ongoing efforts to intervene in world history. This turn, the dominant agent is the Chinese state, which has used Shenzhen to reform the country's planned economy, opening it to global capital. Consider, for example, an abridged history of how Shenzhen was containerized and China integrated into global manufacturing. In 1956, Malcolm McLean launched the world's first container ship and spent the next decade unsuccessfully trying to convince U.S. American ports to containerize. In 1965, however, he succeeded in convincing the United States military that containerization would solve the Army's notorious inability to provision its soldiers in Vietnam. Consequently, in 1966, the United States government built the world's first deep water container port, Newport, And can you hear the pilgrims singing in Saigon? Maclean refilled the empty containers with cheap goods as he passed by Japan on his way back to military ports. The sale of these goods made the return trip profitable. And therein turns the tale. Even as the United States focused on how containerization would facilitate its military efforts, East Asian countries focused instead on the potential of containerization to spur economic growth through export-oriented manufacturing. Less than 5 years later, in 1970, the Japanese government began investing in containerization, and by 1972, launched its own container ships with commercial goods to be sold in North America and Western Europe. In 1972, the Tokyo Bay was the first container ship to call on Kaohsiung Container Terminal, which Hong Kong had built to make the colony as desirable a port of call as Tokyo or Singapore. In the mid-1970s, the world oil market stabilized such that for the first time in history, shipping was a negligible cost in manufacturing and distributing commercial goods. Meanwhile, the Chinese state began looking at export processing and assembly manufacturing as means for stimulating its urban economies. In 1978, the establishment of the Shukou Industrial Zone in western Shenzhen indicated that the PRC aimed not only to participate in global manufacturing, but also to piggyback on the Hong Kong shipping network with an eye toward building its own container ports and shipping capacity. In other words, only a decade, 10 years, separated the Japanese decision to containerize from the establishment of Shenzhen in 1980, the same year that Turning Japanese was released. So that this is really something I think that most of us don't realize, especially those of y'all. How many of y'all remember Japan as a poor country? How many of y'all remember when the US dollar traded at over 300 yen? Right? So the idea that Turning Japanese was released in 1980, we are talking about something that happened in my lifetime and the lifetimes of maybe 3 others of y'all. But it wasn't just the United States that was, turning toward Japan or turning to learn from Japan. China was looking at this there was like a 5-year gap. This is really, it's boom. All this to say, the Shenzhen Condition first presented not because the PRC turned toward the world system, but rather because the country turned toward a mode of manufacturing and distribution which had been invented to make the return trip from the Vietnam theater to the United States profitable. Containerization as such was introduced to East Asia via the United States military intervention in Vietnam, and its economic potential was a side effect. Specifically, containerization and export-oriented manufacturing spread along embattled shipping lanes and via colonial prerogatives. Nevertheless, many of us grapple with the Shenzhen Condition under the rubric urbanization, as if we were only speaking of the emergence of a city, our eyes fixated on the glass towers and superhighways, identifying a city's limits with its skyline. We mistake buildings for polis and ignore connective tissues and social membranes. The city is built, we like to think, in situ. However, human beings meet across passports and state systems, within interstate hierarchies and via cultures, ecologies, and bodies, and of course, production chains and shipping lines. Perhaps recent interest in Shenzhen as an exemplar of urbanization is particularly strong because North Americans are used to thinking of globalization as unidirectional, and the resurgence of China as a global power has forced us to grapple with mutuality in ways that the East Asian tigers didn't. Moreover, Shenzhen has not only successfully localized international economic processes, but also been recognized for doing so, and in doing so become a model for other third world cities and countries to emulate. In other words, Shenzhen signals the rise of the PRC as an important landmark in indigenous capitalist worlds, both at home and abroad. In the rest of this paper, I will deploy Chinese and North American accounts of early manufacturing in Shenzhen to map some of the landmarks of the shared condition, which is not actually thick, but by necessity thin. A membrane, a rebus strip, a window pane in which we are all on the outside looking in at another outside. Today I'm thinking of this condition as a daisy chain of boundary objects which, quote, facilitate cooperation across social worlds without requiring agreement about meaning, close quote. The concept of boundary objects was first developed to explain the collaborative production of scientific facts and systems of classification. For example, the classification of birds resulted from the collaboration between scientists and bird washers, who shared rules in the production of knowledge, even as both groups went on to use this knowledge and the activities themselves to achieve other unrelated goals. In the case of the Shenzhen Condition, I am interested in mapping three boundary objects: the fishing village, the grim frontiers of capitalism, and the catchphrase, time is money. These three boundary objects have enabled North American and Chinese media to deploy early manufacturing in Shenzhen to achieve very different social goals, placing Shenzhen on very different world maps, even as on-the-ground interactions depended on their presumed equivalence and facile translation. All right. So fishing village. In the immediate post-Mao era, the fishing village was a rhetorical placeholder for rural lack in particular, and by extension, the country's poverty in general. The Maoist state systems had segregated urban and rural China from each other, using agricultural surpluses to pay for socialist urbanization. Helen Xu refers to the process as cellularization. Quote, when the collectives were organized, personal autonomy decreased. Peasants were more or less immobilized. Their livelihood in the collectives was overseen by anxious cadres who were not necessarily the best farmers. Along with the peasants' confinement to the collectives came tougher restrictions on rural marketing. Even if they went to markets, there was little to buy or sell. Close quote. The fishing village myth not only framed Chinese receptions of Shenzhen, but also allowed Shenzhen to figure China's post-Mao transition. As in the image of fishing village, Shenzhen was understood to straddle the borders between Hong Kong and China, between rural and urban settlements, and ultimately between past and future. Indeed, as we will see, early accounts of industrial urbanization in the area portray Shenzhen as neither rural nor urban, neither foreign nor domestic, but rather under construction, emphasizing the agency of Beijing leaders. Quote, I suggested the idea of special economic zones, Deng Xiaoping said. The central government approved it, close quote. Thus, the fishing village myth became an important symbol in national debates because it allowed the SEZ to represent a generalized China rather than a specific place. Consider the account of Deng Xiaoping's 1984 inspection tour as told in The Secret of the Shenzhen Sphinx, which was written by a working group of the city's Ministry of Information. On January 24, 1984, Deng arrived in Shenzhen by train, where he was met by leaders and taken by car to his hotel. Quote, on the road, Deng Xiaoping opened the curtain several times to look at the busy construction sites and rising towers, close quote. On the second day of his trip, Deng visited fishing village, Yumincun, which had, upon becoming one of the country's first villages composed entirely of 10,000 yuan households, built each of its 32 families a 2.5-story house. During Deng's inspection, one of the villagers gave China's paramount leader a tour of his new family home, proudly showing off sofas and chairs, a television, a refrigerator, shelves filled with alcohol and cigarettes, and a clean kitchen and bathroom. In fact, pictures of the sitting room showed a standard of living much higher than even in Beijing, prompting Deng to predict that it would take at least 100 years for the rest of rural China to catch up. However, one of the entourage spoke up saying, quote, under your leadership, the transformation will be fast, close quote. And Deng agreed that even so, it would take at least 50 years to transform the rest of China. The report goes on to say that, quote, subsequently when people heard that in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping had proclaimed to the world that the Chinese people's standard of living would be raised to that of a middle-developed country by the middle of the next century, they immediately associated with the, quote, 50 years, close quote, he mentioned in Fishing Village. Domestically, Deng's visit to fishing village functioned within a contemporaneous debate over how China could improve rural conditions. This meant that fishing villages' marginality came to stand for the generalized marginality of farmers throughout China in the Chinese state system. In fact, however, the immediate backdrop to Deng's visit to fishing village was the central state's promulgation of On Rural Work in 1984. The first document released by the central government in 1984, the On Rural Work, emphasized that, quote, on the basis of stabilizing and perfecting the household responsibility system, the goal is to improve production, to smooth distribution, and to develop commodities, close quote. So this is basically saying that the goal for rural reform was actually moving in towards industrialization. The household responsibility system had been promulgated in 1979 and made local cadres responsible for the profits and losses of their respective communes and brigades. Under the household responsibility system, farmers could produce surplus crops and sell their goods at market. In the 3 years from 1979 to 1982, for example, the 32 families of Fishing Village reached the 10,000 yuan annual income milestone by selling fish in both Shenzhen and neighboring Hong Kong. Their success was a clear indication that reforms were benefiting farmers. Not coincidentally, however, at the same time that Deng was visiting Shenzhen, the National Agricultural, Husbandry, and Fishery Bureaus were holding their working meetings. On January 25th, a day after Deng's visit, so a day before the working meetings concluded with decisions for more economic liberalization, Deng visited Fishing Village in Luohu. The polemic of the visit was clear. If reform and opening policies could transform a marginalized village into a new neighborhood where the standard of living rivaled that of Beijing, then liberalization would benefit areas that had had a higher standard of living to begin with. The fishing village myth has operated through two complementary blind spots. First is the blind spot of coherent origin. Locally, Fishing Village was not recognized as local, 本地, or Hakka, 客家. Instead, it comprised fishing families who had, until land reform in 1953, were only allowed off their boats to sell and trade, but required by tradition and law to live on boats that moored near specific villages. In contrast, local villages were located safely inland, well away from annual floods, while Hakka villages were located in the surrounding mountains. In 1953, when local fishing families came on land, they built their homes in floodplains adjacent to the area's extensive riparian system. Consequently, there are Shenzhen fishing villages located in Bao'an, Nanshan, Futian, Luohu, and Dapeng districts. The fishing village that Deng visited in 1984 was built on land reclaimed from the paddies and fish ponds of the Shenzhen River in Luohu district. Although 1984 pictures from the newly constructed village uncannily resemble an American suburban cul-de-sac with 32 identical houses neatly arranged in the middle of polders, nevertheless, there is also something iconically rural about these images. The photo was taken from the east of the village looking southwest along the Shenzhen River at the Hong Kong frontier closed area. Its visual composition makes it all too easy to ignore the rising buildings in the blurred right-hand side of the photo in favor of the geometric polders which extend towards the horizon on the left-hand side of the photo. Yet the pictured rural hinterland is actually Hong Kong, while the rising urban area in the lower right-hand corner lays at the edge of the expanding SEZ with its epicenter at Shenzhen Railway. Indeed, in the long decade after Deng Xiaoping's ascendance, roughly 1978 through 1989, the fishing village came to symbolize the material conditions that reform policies addressed and visually figured Shenzhen's origins as a coherent totality. The caption for Figure 1, for example, emphasizes that each villager was rich, that the village was planned, and that the houses were Western-style private homes. And the other thing that it does is if you look at the poster for my talk, this picture is actually taken from the same place. all of this area, this is the Shenzhen River right here squeezing out there, and all of that polderland over there is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong did not develop because of the border frontier closed area made it illegal to develop in that area, not only because of Sino-British relationships, but also because, and there still is, conflict over which villages on the Hong Kong side or the Chinese side actually have historical claim to the land. And so this entire area has since been filled in. And if you look at the picture on the poster, what you see is this is all now towers. And so towers, towers, towers. But the polder side remains the same. Okay, the second blind spot is of gender. In Shenzhen villages, sons inherited land rights while daughters were given dowries, a tradition that was continued in the construction of new villages, where fathers and sons built housing, including rental properties, while mothers and daughters received stock in collective holdings and were given dowries upon marrying out of the village. Both the specific local fishing village and its symbolic other fishing village were coded as traditional family spaces, such that reform and opening could be seen as a means of furthering traditional values. And so it's important that before we had the expression 城中村, or urbanized villages, we're really looking, these were all called 新村, or new villages, which means even though they were operating under an industrial, modern, corporate logic, this logic, it was seen as traditional because it extended the traditional household division of labor and access to property rights. Moreover, by gendering the origin of the means of production, land, the fishing village myth also naturalized the gender division of labor, which grew out of this system. So, as a little subheading to the fishing village, we have after Tiananmen, from fishing village to village bodies. After Tiananmen, Shenzhen continued to shape national debates because emphasis on the city's rural origins allowed national discourse to pivot from rural place to rural bodies as the site for national transformation. So that in the 1980s, when we're talking about rural urbanization, we're talking about a place. And in the 1990s and up to about 2004, when we talk about rural urbanization, we're talking about migration of rural people into urban spaces. So we pivot on the move from rural space to rural bodies. But it's still within a discourse of rural urbanization. During Shenzhen's long second decade, Chinese stories emphasized that outsourcing and the global production chains were not primarily means for securing cheap consumer goods, but more importantly, were venues for self-fashioning via national development. Those who left their villages to work in a Pingshan factory making plastic toys were able to wash their feet and step on land, 洗脚上田, a four-character Chinese expression referring to the transformation of a farmer who leaves the rice paddies to work in an environment that requires shoes. Those who managed to sneak across the second line, which cordoned off the special zone from the rest of China, found jobs without the necessity of petitioning to have their personal file, 档案, transferred from one work unit to another, offering a degree of employment independence. Those who willingly jumped into the sea of commerce, 下海, or who just took a risk to do something, 干一点事, came to Shenzhen. Articles collected in the volume Deng Xiaoping in Shenzhen, Spring 1992, right? 1992年春. All right, now, how many of you know the song about the 1992 spring? God, we've got 5 more people. I feel like I'm entering the present. Published by the Shenzhen Ministry of Information, Spring 1992, included the text of Deng's Southern Tour speech, as well as articles from local newspapers, including the Special Zone Daily, 特区报, and the Shenzhen Commercial Press, 深圳商报. The key trope in the SEC's long second decade was daring to pioneer Shenzhen, 敢闯深圳. The expression came from the published speech of Deng's 1992 Southern Tour, which explicitly connected political stability to economic liberalization. Quote, If not for the success of reform and opening, we could not pass Chuang, the Tiananmen uprising gate. Being unable to pass, the situation would devolve to chaos. Chaos results in civil war. The Cultural Revolution was a civil war." Close quote. For example, 8 editorials from the Shenzhen Commercial Press elaborated the connection between the bodies of migrant workers and post-Tiananmen China through the Chuang metaphor. Chuang referred to the courage to make breakthroughs in forbidden areas, 禁区, blind spots, 盲区, and difficult areas, 难区. Importantly, the relative poverty of the fishing village was repeatedly deployed to define the courage and daring necessary for pioneering. This rhetoric pivoted on how lack of status, lack of courage, lack of understanding, lack of material well-being was overcome through the construction of the SEZ. Quote, "How did the Shenzhen Special Zone go from not having to having, and then making the world take notice of its accomplishments?" Close quote. Chuang also exemplified the principle of seeking truth from facts, 事实求是. Quote, "When facing the necessity of reform and opening, some close their eyes and stuff their ears, holding on to their deformities and preserving their lack. Some are busy watching the breeze, while some listen to the wind, rather than addressing the actual situation and pushing forward reforms." Close quote. Watching the breeze and listening to the wind referred to engaging the world through emptied slogans from the immediate past. The fishing village myth made a simple point. Throughout its brief history, Shenzhen symbolized the state's potential to remake itself through the hard work, courage, and resilience of its citizens. In other words, through the ideology of Chuang, the act of migrating to Shenzhen became recoded as support for the policies of reform and opening, and the ideology of rural urbanization became recoded as rural migration to the cities. The focus on rural bodies, like the fishing village, like the original instance of the fishing village narrative, piggybacked on traditional gender inequalities, implicitly legitimating many social changes through male and female social roles. Throughout Shenzhen's first 25 years, rural bodies that were primarily engaged in manufacturing were female, while constructing the city and owning buildings was accomplished by male bodies. Indeed, some estimates suggest that the percentage of female factory workers has been as high as 70%, making assembly line work an explicitly female occupation. During the 1995 exhibition to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the founding of the SEZ, for example, representations of Chuang focused on the mythical transformation of soldiers into construction workers, while women were represented as factory workers and wives. In other words, and just on this note, my actual visa in Shenzhen remains because I'm a wife, and it's actually easier for me to get a visa as a wife than as an employer, and I'm paid under the table. In other words, manufacturing labor was feminized while the factories themselves were masculinized. A gendered hierarchy that did not map exactly onto the distribution of resources in the traditional fishing village, but did nevertheless reproduce the traditional structure of gendered inequity. The clearest articulation of the gendered overlap between traditional rural households and the organization of manufacturing, for example, has been the gendering of remittances. In their role as sisters, many rural working girls have sent money home in order to pay for the construction of their brothers' houses. Once their brothers' houses have been completed, if they marry, the young women then marry and move into their husbands' houses, which have been built or purchases with remittances from their sisters-in-law. As we will see in the next section, the feminization of labor and masculinization of the means of production also resonated and continues to resonate with foreign representations of Shenzhen. So take away from the fishing village as a boundary object, what we're going to need as we move into Western stories of Shenzhen. As a narrative, the fishing village is a national Bildungsroman, in which a marginalized fishing village, moribund by the excesses of socialist production, is given an opportunity to experiment with capitalist manufacturing and commerce in order to realize the socialist dream of, quote, surpassing England and catching up to the United States. Chao Ingame, close quote. The city comes into its own through heroic determination, hard work, and perseverance. It thinks it can, and suddenly, given the right leaders, the little fishing village that could exceeds expectations. As rhetoric, the fishing village myth works through simple before and after images, with text describing the forces and events that transformed image A into image B. The visceral contrast between low-lying farmhouses and skyscrapers, dirt paths and highways, or malnourished farmers in Mao coats and plump entrepreneurs in Western business suits are all deployed to illustrate the city's rural urbanization makeover. Most documentaries of the city begin with photographs of aquaculture, especially oyster cultivation, and then cut to overhead footage of Shenan Road and the expansive glass and steel skyscrapers that border the city's main thoroughfare. So yeah, you take this picture and compare it to any picture of Shenzhen, and that is the ideology of the fishing village. As ideology, the fishing village myth continues to find purchase among Shenzhen residents and the general Chinese public because it resonates with many migrants' experiences of self-transformation. The act of migrating to Shenzhen did allow many people to improve their lives, and they are accordingly grateful to the city, and by extension to the state, for giving them that opportunity. What's more, as we will see in the analysis of the grim frontiers of capitalism myth, the continuation of gendered hierarchies with respect to village land and housing rights not only have legitimated claims that that village wealth is an elaboration of tradition, but also facilitated foreign appropriation of the fishing village myth and concomitant investment in and management of factories in Shenzhen. Okay, so grim frontiers. And like the key moment in this picture, I don't know if y'all can see it, basic argument of this section is white guy can't find himself in Asia, so he writes a story about how hard his life is. North Americans have been slow to acknowledge our intimacies with Shenzhen. Throughout its first 3 decades, 1980 through 2010, Shenzhen, when it appeared in English language media, was dismissed as an uninteresting tourist destination because it was insufficiently Chinese. Cheap fakes and cheaper sex were available to those who were willing to take their chances in the city's frontier environment. But for a Chinese experience, articles encouraged Westerners to head inland, while those who came to work in Shenzhen were often compensated for their hardship posting with bonuses and private school tuition for children. Indeed, throughout its first 2 decades, some multinational companies paid their employees hardship bonuses for being posted in Shenzhen, and the most egregious exemplars of this were the petro-oil companies, and this is critical to where the South China Sea is going. So that the Seven Sisters, Shell, and these folks, they gave, and this is, I don't have actual proof from the companies, I have reports from my friends who worked in the companies. Depending on your position in the company, you could have as much as a 40% annual bonus for working in Shenzhen during the early establishment of the South China Sea oil industry. And yet, if you receive, okay, this is again where we're showing our age. If you received a Cabbage Patch Kid during a Christmas rush in the early 1980s, a small piece of your childhood was fabricated in Shenzhen. If you blasted LL Cool J on a boombox or have expressed yourself on a personal computer, some portion of your identity was assembled in Shenzhen. If you've listened to music on a Walkman or watched movies on a tablet, your taste was miniaturized in Shenzhen. And although the production chains that link Shenzhen to North American Christmases, hip-hop, and hacking, as well as to fast fashion, cloning, animation, and commercial drones, have been significantly transformed since the establishment of the SEZ, there's every chance that if you are a resident of North America, then key features of your identity have been and or are produced in Shenzhen. The temporal lag between the establishment of the SEZ and North American awareness that we had turned toward China has been one of the critical factors in forming the intercultural manifestation of the Shenzhen Condition. Even as the fishing village myth shifted its emphasis from rural place to rural bodies, North Americans began to engage Shenzhen. Importantly, early Western representations of the SEZ ignored the area's rural past, focusing instead on its manufacturing present and taking at face value its gendered hierarchies. Perhaps the most widely circulated example of how North Americans experienced Shenzhen was written by a Canadian author and illustrator, Guy Delisle. First published in 2000, 20 years after the establishment of the SEZ, Delisle's Shenzhen preceded his more popular account of Pyongyang. Shenzhen sarcastically narrates the author's estrangement from his immediate environment, and he chronicles his encounters with, quote, the smells, the noise, the crowds, the dirt everywhere, close quote. By the time Delisle arrived in Shenzhen circa 1997, outsourcing had already replaced vertical integration as the norm for global manufacturing. Barbie, for example, had her own supply chain with her body produced in Shenzhen and other Chinese cities using US, American molds and European machines. The doll's nylon hair was spun in Japan, her plastic fabricated in Taiwan, and her pigments manufactured in the United States. Indeed, in the early 1970s, North American and Western European companies had already been restructuring production with low-skilled manufacturing operations relocated to zones in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, while by the late 1990s, engineering and software jobs were also being outsourced, the gendered division of labor and ownership consistent despite changing locales. Delisle went to Shenzhen to supervise the animation production layout and edge smoothing work for a French studio. The job itself embodied the hierarchies of global cultural production, with creative work located in Europe and North America, and non-creative work first located in Korea and Taiwan, and then in the PRC, as well as, quote, the usual maladies of the long-term border, cultural and linguistic alienation, boredom, and cravings for Western food and real coffee, in the hideously expanding special economic zone of Guangdong province, a tariff-free city north of Hong Kong, where the employers are foreign and the Cantonese locals hungry, close quote. Unsurprisingly, Delisle's charcoal sketches evoke the stereotypical grime, material and spiritual, that we've come to associate with industrial urbanization since Dickens. Cramped and redundant work, unidentifiable and derivative spaces, and an environment that is relentlessly, oppressively instrumental. One works until exhaustion for money that is insufficient to purchase objects of individualized desire. More to the point, the book's cover shows a solitary white man in a mass of Chinese figures. Much as turning Japanese was misread as a metaphor for masturbation and intended as a metaphor for unexpected transformation, Shenzhen was misread as a metaphor for white estrangement from themselves specifically and the world more generally, rather than as, kind of very prosaic. Now that Asia is the center of the world economy, what the fuck do we do, right? But instead it was taken as an exemplar of existential angst. Traditional media, including The Guardian, Time, and The New York Times, positively reviewed the book, and the popular book review website, Goodreads, still gives it a 4.5 stars review. Readers have raved about the quality of the book's illustrations, while praising the text precisely because Delisle refused any meaningful engagement with Shenzhen, its residents, and its national aspirations in order to better gripe about how horrible it is for a Westerner to live at, quote, the grim frontiers of free trade, close quote. One reviewer even asserted, quote, Delisle's keen awareness of how and why he can't connect to the city makes for a rarity, a thoroughly engaging memoir of being bored to distraction, close quote. Without commenting on the book's claim to describe said city or even passing interest in the inequalities of globalization, which had already been so naturalized as to be invisible to its beneficiaries. Shenzhen also exemplifies the rhetoric of manly snark about experiences in the SEZ as opposed to engagement with the city outside of privileged work contexts. Foreigners' quality of life has been evaluated with respect to the general satisfaction of Western men, rather than with an eye to understanding what manufacturing jobs have meant locally. In 2007, for example, Esquire correspondent Colby Buzzell wrote a 9-page article that condensed his experiences in the city to the tagline, quote, "So if China is now the world capital of rapacious, blood-thirsty capitalism, then that must make Shenzhen, a city of 11 million that didn't exist 20 years ago, the most bloodthirsty city on earth, but not without its charms," close quote. On his trip to Shenzhen, Buzzell watched migrant construction workers and wondered when they would break out in a sweat, mused about his vans being made in China, talked with white men in Shukho, those oil people, for insights into Shenzhen, compared the quality of his Made in America bicycle with the Made in China bicycle he bought in Shenzhen, and then returned a Chinese person's hospitality by moaning about how much he disliked karaoke. Not surprisingly, Buzzell visited what other white men told him was Working Girl Street, although these working girls were sex workers and not assembly line workers. The only person who was accorded respect in Buzzell's article was a Chinese interlocutor who told him what he expected to hear. Most young people don't know about Tiananmen, and Shenzhen people only care about making money. Not unexpectedly, Buzzell's text implies that because he, unlike young Shenzhen residents, both knew what happened on June 4th, 1989, and cared about making more than money, he was thus qualified to write about the city. Significantly, in Buzzell's article, sarcasm is a rhetorical device that simultaneously asserted the author's superiority and excused him from learning about the city through more conventional routes. Why should he bother interviewing local historians, reading published materials about the city, arranging a visit to its factories, and hiring a qualified interpreter to talk with residents when the city was so obviously beneath his contempt? That the city was also a potential threat to Westerners was a theme picked up in the following year, 2008, when Naomi Klein visited Shenzhen to investigate China's all-seeing eye. The article tagline, quote, "With the help of U.S. defense contractors, China is building the prototype for a high-tech police state. It is ready for export," close quote. This article highlighted the complicity between multinational capitalists and governments. Klein discusses globalization in terms of the cooperation between U.S. and Chinese companies to develop and integrate surveillance technologies as the result of tacit cooperation between the two governments. According to the article, the goal of the Golden Shield is to make it possible to cross-reference data from cell phones, computers, cameras, facilitating the surveillance of Chinese citizens and in institutions workers. The goal of the companies is to sell the technology back to the United States, where it will be used to monitor domestic and international residents. Suddenly, our shared condition was seen as potentially dangerous to U.S. Americans because this bellicose mode of production could be reintroduced on North American soil. Klein's Shenzhen was neither Chinese nor American, but rather the place where China becomes more like the United States and the United States more like China. For Klein, Shenzhen was the place where capitalism and totalitarianism were reworked into market Stalinism, which would be redeployed throughout the rest of China and exported to the United States. Not surprisingly, market Stalinism combined the worst excesses of both socialism and capitalism to become the inner logic of globalization. The accompanying photographs by Thomas Lee invoke the aesthetic conventions of creative photography to organize visual impressions of Shenzhen. In these pictures, people are in the foreground are blurred, while the background is in focus. When paired with Klein's text, the images showed a Shenzhen that was depersonalized, off-kilter, and slightly menacing. And one of the things I'd like to say here is that I'm actually in solidarity with Klein's project to kind of look at how capitalism and socialism have come together to do this. Where I'm actually against her rhetoric is that it depends on demonizing all of China and all Chinese people in order to call attention to the threats of that very flashy and very quotable market Stalinism. CNN Asia Online correspondent Christopher DeWolf was the first Western journalist to advocate a visit to Shenzhen to experience the city's, quote, unexpectedly seductive mix of arts venues, outdoor eating, beer gardens, and tacky kitsch. DeWolf's list of 10 things that would change skeptical minds about Shenzhen included visits to the artsy venues of the overseas Chinese town, the Mixi Mall for good, cheap, and large portions of Chinese bao, the barbecue joints in Honey Lake, the hiking trails of Wutong Mountain. A full decade after Shenzhen was published in French, in a mere 2 years after Klein figured the city as threatening product of Chimerican wheeling and dealing, DeWolf wrote both within and against the set of expectations that had characterized negative takes on Shenzhen. With the exception of Klein, these writers assumed that a Chinese city should be English-friendly and fun. It should be clean and hip. It should have a few off-color beaten tracks. Overall, the implied visitor to Shenzhen is a Western man who lives and works in China or Hong Kong and should be able to easily avail himself of the city's pleasures without the inconvenience of actually learning anything about the city, unless, of course, he wants to visit the city's historic sites and enjoy the fission between the idea of Shenzhen as an instant city and its 1,000-year history. To get a sense of how quickly Shenzhen has been catching up to Western ideas of what a city should be and who its main subjects are, it is important to remember that although the industrial parks and workers' dormitories that once compromised key urban landmarks have been demolished or upgraded since the 2005 decision to redevelop the city as a regional center of finance, design, IT, biotech research, and logistics. Nevertheless, the fishing village myth continues to fuel the expectation that Shenzhen should provide migrants with opportunities to transform their lives. In fact, the opportunity to refashion the self, to proactively change one's fate without actually transforming gendered inequality, continues to be an accepted element of many residents' understanding of what makes their city special, and most Westerners' understanding of what makes Shenzhen Chinese. What's more, it seems that national leaders agree. Since Xi Jinping became General Secretary in 2012 and Premier Li Keqiang's support for IT and hardware innovation in 2015, Shenzhen has increasingly symbolized the new China. The celebratory appearance of Shenzhen on tourist websites like TripAdvisor, WikiTravel, and Ctrip, in addition to Chinese English-language Shenzhen-dedicated sites, accumulates the city's emergence, not only as a destination for Western tourists, but also as a positive landmark within Western cognitive maps of post-Mao China. Popular Western accounts of the city now embrace Shenzhen as a hip, vibrant, and tech-savvy Chinese city that, on the face of it, lives with familiar North American middle-class values and aspirations, presenting opportunities to those willing to come. From fishing village to city, anticipating enthusiastic endorsements of the city as a tourist site by half a decade, writing, quote, Shenzhen surprises most visitors who just expect a peek at a very serious mainland China, but find a thriving club and indie music nightlife or squads of housewives breaking out dance moves in public squares into the evening, close quote. Indeed, by the time DeWolf became interested in Shenzhen in 2010, the city had already approved and was pursuing its third master plan, which targeted higher value-adding segments of the global economy, increasingly within the context of Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road policy. In 2012, what might be described as a kind of design tourism or creative sojourning took off when one of the first international hardware incubator programs opened offices in Shenzhen. In 2013, the MIT Media Lab also visited Shenzhen in order to explore the innovation opportunities that Shenzhen affords. Suddenly, Western individual makers, startups, and multinational companies recognized that Shenzhen's capacity for electronics manufacturing especially its capacity to design, produce, and distribute cell phones and smart devices, was no longer a simple story of cheap production and low-quality, unimaginative knockoffs, but rather a story of how the city's Shanghai ecology has facilitated the worldwide shift from making as a hobby to making as an entrepreneurial practice. Moreover, it is this moment that gender again sutures the two myths. Young makers are overwhelmingly male, just as line workers remain overwhelmingly female. Thus, by 2015, Shenzhen had not only become a key player in the worldwide maker movement, but also effectively deindustrialized its core areas, so that now design is located in the interior areas and manufacturing has been pushed out to the outer districts. Together, the fishing village and Grim Frontiers myths emerged as boundary objects that have mediated complementary takes on early manufacturing in Shenzhen from two privileged positions, that of the Chinese state and Western capital, which have been figured as enlightened party cadres, Deng Xiaoping, and board overseas managers. And we can look at DeLille, but any of the visiting CEOs, respectively. What's more, even though both myths have recently dovetailed in celebrating IT, hardware, making, and entrepreneurship, this is just grease for juggernaut wheels. The practical translation between the two myths was first achieved through their almost identical narrative structures and reduction of Shenzhen to a single dimension. Both myths, for example, located Shenzhen in China. And it's clear that Shenzhen is not a Guangdong city. It is a Chinese city. Both emphasize the city's marginality. Both describe Shenzhen as a place where people labor for wages, figuring Shenzhen as factory of the world. Both assume that the agent of history was male. Moreover, both myths left out similar information about Shenzhen as a historical place. Neither the fishing village nor Grim Frontiers myth referred to the area's linguistic or cultural diversity. Neither addressed Cold War and colonial legacies in determining and enforcing the current Shenzhen-Hong Kong border. Neither acknowledged the rapid containerization of the region and the industrialization of East Asia in general. In other words, although manufacturing was acknowledged, nevertheless, the generalization of the two myths structured encounters between North Americans and Chinese subjects as an encounter between domestic power politics and foreign capital. Taken together, the myths tell a story of the world system and ignores its Chinese and North American indigenes. Perhaps not unexpectedly, therefore, a key feature of the Shenzhen Condition is that North Americans have frequently misrecognized Chinese people as being dupes of the state, and Chinese people have just as frequently assumed that North Americans are wealthy bosses living carefree lives. Unfortunately, these characterizations are not wrong. They are just superficial enough to facilitate easy translation without acknowledging mutual humanity. For example, one of the first facts that North Americans not only learn about Shenzhen, but actually remember and quote ad nauseum is Shenzhen used to be a fishing village. While Shenzheners have been quick to accept the Grim Frontiers valuation of manufacturing, which is totally at odds with the socialist evaluation of industrialization and factory work as a means of achieving national goals. Nevertheless, embedded in each boundary object is not simply the potential for, but also the call for economic reforms to bring about political change and social justice. And this is where the time is money quote becomes very important. Governance is male, and the world economy is dollars. And what brings it all together in the New Year's moment is the system is legitimated through appeals to opportunity. So located at the foot of Broadcast Hill on Shekou Industrial Road, the sign, "Time is money, efficiency is life, 时间是金钱，效率是生命," has marked the entry to the Shekou terminal since 1981. During the 1980s, it was the first sign that visitors saw upon exiting the ferry terminal and the last slogan they carried as they returned to Hong Kong. The large sign not only announced the capitalist intentions of the Shekou industrial zone, but also expressed a not-so-subtle critique of the socialist system. On the one hand, the slogan is explicitly identified with the changes that containerization wrought. the transformation of 6 natural bays into a container terminal that stretches from Shekou to Sichuan, the construction of a diverse factory complex, some for assembling dolls, cheap electronics and textiles, some for manufacturing plastic bathroom sets, and others for producing industrial goods such as floating glass and engines. On the other hand, the slogan quoted Benjamin Franklin, a man who had encouraged the individual accumulation of wealth. And indeed, until the 1984 inspection tour, when Deng Xiaoping stated that his support for the Shekou industrial zone and the experiments of its leader Yuan Geng, the Chinese media and its pundits debated the implications of supplanting Karl Marx with the man on the $100 bill. The pro-Marx positions focused on what might happen when the means of production were privatized, but basically left the control of the state. In contrast, the pro-Shekou position pointed out that there was something reactionary, downright knee-jerkish, in seeing only the downside to capitalism. Even Marx, they pointed out, saw capitalism as a necessary step on the way to socialism. All right, so the important part of the Time is Money stories is basically we usually forget that time is money operates in a parallel construct. For Benjamin Franklin, the parallel structure was time is money, credit is money. And so for Benjamin Franklin, the important part about accumulating capital was accumulating money was that you would have enough independence to do what you wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was, for example, fly kites and discover electricity or whatnot. And that this was only possible in systems in which you were a particular kind of person, a particular kind of person who could get credit. And so he was very much approved of independent entrepreneurs. The actual parallel in the Time is Money section, efficiency is life, is actually the same kind of a parallel couplet in which the personal accumulation of wealth is justified by a different kind of structuring of the means of production. Because what had happened was Lu Xun had written an article in which he said basically that Westerners say time is money, but I say basically, okay, here we go. Wage labor was part of Shanghai's colonial factory system. Within and against this activist history, Americans say time is money, but I think that time is life. The unlimited consumption of other people's time, in fact, is murder for profit. And so saying that efficiency is life, Yuan Geng was actually participating in a critical discourse that said factories, whether they belonged to the state or belonged to a capitalist, had a responsibility not to murder their employees. And so efficiency in life allowed for the production of a certain kind of civil society. And indeed, Shekou was one of the first places in China that had a very influential free newspaper. It had a very vast civil society, and we can get more into that if we want. But the point here is that the time is money meme allows for the convergence of Philadelphia 1748 and Shekou 1978, where individual opportunity becomes justification for increased expansion of monopoly capitalism. Together, the rhetorical similarities between the grim frontiers and fishing village myths, as well as the promise of opportunity latent in the time is money myth, suggest how Shenzhen functions as a metonym for the transition from the US-centered Cold War, roughly 1945 to the 1990s, to the Chinese-centered era of reform and opening, 1978 to 2010, and the advent of one road, one belt. These overlapping historic moments have created the conditions for an emergent world order, which we might provisionally call chimerica, if so inclined. And this is not to say what seems clear in retrospect was actually unclear at the time. Both myths reduce Shenzhen to one dimension because they assume that proper history moves from grim states of being toward world domination, even if the Chinese seem more inclined to see this as an explicitly political process, and North Americans continue to highlight the role of relatively independent economic actors. In Shenzhen, China achieved a goal that was first articulated by Mao Zedong to surpass England and catch up to the United States. It is at this moment of celebratory making in entrepreneurship, this moment when the right to pursue opportunity becomes a shared value independent of individual success and failure, that the narrative content of the fishing village myth dovetails with that of the grim frontiers, and the time is money myth looms as world history. Suddenly, it is as if US Americans and Chinese have been telling the same story all along. It was just a question of where it would all come together. Thank you.